The World Football League was a short-lived American football league that played in 1974 and part of 1975. Although the league's proclaimed ambition was to bring American football onto a worldwide stage, the farthest the WFL reached was placing a team the Hawaiians in Honolulu, Hawaii. The league folded midway through its second season, in 1975. A new minor football league began play as the World Football League in 2008 after acquiring the rights to its trademarks and intellectual property. History: Gary Davidson was the driving force behind the WFL. He had helped start the successful American Basketball Association and World Hockey Association, some of whose teams survived long enough to enter the established National Basketball Association and National Hockey League. His World Football League did not bring any surviving teams into the National Football League, much less survive as a whole league. To get the league off the ground, Davidson knew he needed investors. At a press conference held in Chicago, Davidson announced his core of investors, a group of men he called the Founding Fathers. These men were Robert Schmertz, who owned the WHA's New England Whalers and NBA's Boston Celtics. A former hockey prospect named Howard Baldwin, who ran the Boston Bulls charter. Ben Hatskin, who owned the WHA's Winnipeg Jets. And a Steve Arnold, another WHA associate. Perhaps one of the biggest of the Founding Fathers was a Canadian movie producer, John F. Bassett. A former tennis prodigy and owner of the WHA's Toronto Toros, Bassett came from a wealthy Canadian family. The family owned the Toronto Argonauts of the Canadian Football League, 2 Toronto newspapers and interests in television stations. The younger Bassett himself had been mulling over starting his own professional football league when he happened to meet Davidson and was given a franchise for Toronto. Along with the original Founding Fathers, the rest of the owners would soon fall into place, including a man whose own dreams of playing football were ended by a heart ailment, Thomas Arija, who would run the Chicago Fire. Several prospective owners were forced to drop out. Davidson was willing to sell his Philadelphia team to investor Harry J. Katz. Alas, Davidson would learn that Katz didn't have the strong resources that he claimed, and was in fact the target of several lawsuits. Davidson pulled back his offer to sell the rights to Philadelphia. He nearly sold the Detroit franchise to a man named Bud Hull, but it was later discovered Hull had been arrested 30 times and faced 27 lawsuits related to his previous business dealings. Davidson had initially planned for his league to commence play in 1975. However, the league came under pressure to accelerate its timetable, largely on account of strained labor relations affecting both established professional leagues. By the spring of 1974, players were threatening to go on strike in both the NFL and CFL, which could have delayed the start of their own seasons and/or caused the quality of their product to deteriorate in the event owners in the established leagues had attempted to bring in replacement players. The possibility of being the only major professional football league in operation appeared to be too good of an opportunity to pass up. Combined with rumors of another upstart league, it persuaded Davidson to advance the new league's planned debut to 1974. One team went through several identities. The team slated to play in Maryland was to be called the Washington Capitals, but the expansion NHL team had already trademarked the rights to the nickname. A contest held to name the team came up with the name Ambassadors. The team then became the Baltimore Washington Ambassadors, and then the Baltimore name was dropped, and the team simply became known as the Washington Ambassadors. In order to boost ticket sales, Washington owner Joe Wheeler offered former Baltimore Colts quarterback Johnny Unitas a contract as head coach and general manager of the team. Unitas declined, stating that he was already under contract to the San Diego Chargers. Spurned by Unitas, Wheeler reached out to Redskins linebacker Jack Pardee with the same offer. Pardee jumped at the chance, and quickly signed with a new league. Wheeler in the meantime had engaged in a war for territory with Pardee's old boss, Redskins owner Edward Bennett Williams. Wheeler wanted the Ambassadors to play at RFK Stadium, but Williams refused to allow it. Williams won the war, and the Ambassadors were on the move. Without ever stepping on the field, the team went through their third relocation, starting off as the Baltimore Washington Ambassadors, to the Washington Ambassadors, and finally the Virginia Ambassadors. The fledgling WFL did succeed in raising stagnant salaries in the NFL. Average salaries in professional football were among the lowest in the four major North American sports. The National Football League Players Association and the Canadian Football League Players Association have both gone on strike prior to their leagues' respective 1974 seasons in an effort to lift many of the rules suppressing free agency and player salaries. With the uncertain labor situation, the WFL had the opportunity to provide players with a better deal than the established leagues would give them, along with the promise of employment. Davidson's league garnered major publicity when the Toronto Northmen, led by John F. Bassett, signed three Miami Dolphins players, fullback Larry Csonka, halfback Jim Kiick, and wide receiver Paul Warfield to what was then the richest three-player deal in sports, an astounding $3.5 million to start in 1975. The pact was a guaranteed, personal services contract, so the trio would be paid even if the WFL did not survive its first season. The NFL took notice, as did their players when they were approached to jump leagues. The Oakland Raiders lost both their quarterbacks. Ken Stapler, who signed with the Birmingham Americans, and Darrell LaMonica, who penned a contract to play for the Southern California Sun starting in 1975. John Wilbur left the over-the-hill gang as a Washington Redskin to invest, coach special teams, and play for the Hawaiians. The Dallas Cowboys also took roster hits when WFL teams in Hawaii and Houston signed running back Calvin Hill and quarterback Craig Morton respectively. The Hawaiians also signed Minnesota Vikings Pro Bowl W. John Gilliam and San Francisco 49ers All-Pro T.E. Ted Kwolek. However, Gilliam ended up with the Chicago Winds and Kwolek signed with the Philadelphia Bell prior to the 1975 season. By early June 1974, the WFL claimed they had some 60 NFL players under contract. The top minor leagues in the United States at the time, the Atlantic Coast Football League and Seaboard Football League, were also tremendously affected. The ACFL had survived a suspension of operations in 1972 to return to play in 1973, only to have the WFL lure away most of the ACFL's and SFL's players with the prospect of playing in a major league. Both leagues were forced to fold. The ACFL and half the SFL folded immediately, with two teams joining the four remaining SFL teams to play in 1974. The SFL folded after an abbreviated 1974 season. 1974 season playing a 20-game regular season schedule in 1974 6 games longer than the NFL's then 14-game slate the WFL staged no exhibition games. The season was to begin on Wednesday, July 10 and end on Wednesday, November 13. This was a 20-game season in 19 weeks, a schedule accomplished by having double games on Labor Day weekend. Some complained that the schedule was poorly drafted. Although most teams played on Wednesday nights with a national TV game slated for Thursday nights, the Hawaiians played their home games on Sunday afternoons. This meant that when the Hawaiians had a home game, he played an opponent who flew to Honolulu after having played just 4 days earlier. In addition, back-to-back meetings between two teams were common. The WFL held a college draft in 1974, the first 6 rounds were held on January 22, 1974 with the remaining 30 rounds held February 5. David Janes, quarterback from Kansas, was the first player selected in the draft by Houston. As was common with many upstart leagues, the WFL's intended lineup of teams changed several times before they even played a down. Most notably, Bassett's Toronto Northmen were forced to find a new home after the Canadian government threatened to ban any American football team from competing with the CFL. Though the Canadian Football Act never passed, the mere threat of it prompted Bassett to move the team to Memphis, where it became the Memphis Southmen, but was generally referred to by fans, local media, and even some official team materials as the Grizzlies. The WFL suffered an even more serious blow when the CFL reached an agreement with its striking players, followed quickly by a settlement ending the NFL players' strike that ensured the upstart league would be forced to compete with both of its established rivals. The original schedule called for a 4-team playoff, with semi-final games held on Thursday, November 20, 21, and the World Bowl on Friday, November 29 at the Gator Bowl Stadium in Jacksonville, Florida. League officials boldly discussed plans for expansion teams in Europe and Asia. In the first few weeks, the WFL looked to be a resounding success. Attendance outpaced the first week of the American Football League in 1960, averaging just under 43,000 a game. The box office numbers proved to be the beginning of the WFL's undoing when two teams admitted to inflating their gates on a grand scale. The Jacksonville Sharks admitted that out of the 105,892 fans who attended their first two games, anywhere from 14,000 to 44,000 had gotten in for free. The Philadelphia Bell, whose first two home games totaled 120,253 fans, admitted that 100,198 tickets had been given away for free or sold at significantly reduced prices. Presumably the giveaways were intended in part to pique the public's curiosity and interest, but they ended up seriously eroding the league's credibility. 6 games into the first season, WFL franchises were in serious trouble. The Detroit Wheels were looking to move to Charlotte, and the Florida Blazers made overtures of bringing the first-place club to Atlanta. The league seemed to bottom out in September, when 2 franchises relocated in mid-season. The Houston Texans moved to Shreveport, Louisiana as the Shreveport Steamer, and they were followed a week later by the New York Stars, who relocated to Charlotte as the Charlotte Hornets. On top of this, the Wheels briefly moved 1 game to London, Ontario. It was discovered that in the rush to commence play in 1974, several WFL teams had paid less than the original $120,000 franchise fee in order to meet Davidson's target of 12 teams, and that league officials had conducted little to no due diligence. As a result, most of the league's teams were badly undercapitalized. By most accounts, the only reasonably well-financed teams were Memphis, Philadelphia, the Hawaiians and Southern California. In many cases, WFL teams were unable to meet the most basic of team expenses. For instance, the Portland Storm's players were reportedly being fed by sympathetic local fans, while the Hornets had their uniforms impounded for not paying a laundry bill from the time the team was located in New York. The Birmingham Americans were not paid for the last 2 months of the season, the Florida Blazers went 3 months without pay, and the Sharks were not paid for what turned out to be their last 6 games. The other teams' finances were not much better. The Southmen, Bell and Hawaiians were the only teams who met payroll for every week of the season. The most dire situation, however, was that of the Detroit Wheels. The team's original 33 owners appeared to pay for team expenses out of pocket as they arose, resulting in what amounted to a club football team playing at the professional level. On several occasions, the team was left without uniforms when they did not pay the cleaning bill, forcing them to cancel practice. After several hotels and airlines went unpaid, the Wheels were unable to fly to games or get a place for the players to stay without paying in advance. One player was forced to pay a hospital bill for his son out of pocket because the team's insurance policy was worthless. The coaches were unable to film games. The low point came before a game in Philadelphia against the Bell, when the team ran out of tape for the players' ankles. Just when it looked like the Wheels would have to forfeit, a salesman donated enough tape to allow them to play. The league was forced to take over the team after complaints from the players. Perhaps one of the most bizarre incidents for the WFL in 1974 involved defensive end John Matos-Zark, who had left the NFL's Houston Oilers to play for the WFL's Houston Texans. While Matos-Zark worked out on the field, attorneys for the Oilers and federal marshals arrived at the stadium. Shortly after sacking New York Stars quarterback Tom Sherman, Matos-Zark was lifted from the game. The team had been handed a restraining order, and Matos-Zark could not play another down for the Texans. Matos-Zark waved the document for the home crowd to see, as to indicate why he was sitting on the bench. A federal judge ruled that Matos-Zark could not play for the Texans, since he was still under contract to the Oilers. the judge ruled that Matusark could play for the Texans only when his NFL contract was up, meaning that Matusark could not play for the Texans until the 1978 season. In October, the league pulled the plug on the Wheels and the Sharks after 14 games. The folding of the Jacksonville franchise meant that the Gator Bowl would not host World Bowl I. Davidson was forced to resign by the end of October 1974, and Hawaiians owner Christopher Hemeta was named the new commissioner a month later. Late in the year, the league announced that it would award its most valuable player a cash prize of $10,000 at the World Bowl. It was literally a cash prize. Rather than endure the embarrassment of media sneers about whether a WFL check would clear, the league neatly stacked cash high upon a table in the middle of the field. The MVP award was a three-way split, and the players involved split the cash. The playoff format itself was also chaotic. Numerous playoff formats were tossed around, including brackets ranging from 3 to 8 teams, and one owner who even suggested that the World Bowl be cancelled and the championship handed to the regular season champion Memphis Southmen. Eventually, 6 teams were chosen for the tournament, all 3 division winners, and 3 wildcards. One of the wildcards was supposed to be the Hornets, who finished at 10-10. However, their game against the Blazers had to be aborted when only 1,000 tickets were sold, not nearly enough for the Hornets to justify the trip. The 9-11 bell took their place. Despite the disasters, many thought the WFL performed fairly well, though below NFL standards. Many games were tight, decided by 7 points or less, and the action point, the 1-point conversion run or pass attempt after a touchdown, was favored among WFL coaches and critics. The league championship the World Bowl, or World Bowl IA was staged in Birmingham between the hometown Birmingham Americans and the Florida Blazers. Not even the World Bowl could go off without a hitch. For a time, it appeared that the game would not take place because the Americans owed $237,000 in back federal taxes. However, the Internal Revenue Service agreed to let the game go ahead in return for a portion of the gate. Both teams were owed several weeks' back pay. The Americans only agreed to play when their owner promised them championship rings if they won. Aside from the money woes the league was having, the players did not hold back in complaining about the officiating during the game. Florida Blazers running back Tommy Riemann scored what he thought was a touchdown, but the officials on the field ruled that he fumbled the ball out of the end zone before he hit the ground, resulting in a touchback that gave the ball to Birmingham. Replays clearly showed that the ball had broken the plane of the end zone before slipping out of Riemann's hands. While the phantom turnover did not account for any Birmingham points, it did serve to break the spirits of the Blazers. Birmingham led 15-0, with Birmingham quarterback Matthew Reed scoring an action point. Birmingham led 22-0, and thought they had the game wrapped up. However, Florida managed a small comeback, trailing 22-21 as the gun went off in the fourth quarter. After the game, the Americans' jerseys were seized to satisfy team debts. As if losing a championship game in a squeaker was not bad enough, things got much worse. Florida head coach Jack Pardee bolted back to the NFL to take over the Chicago Bears. Shortly afterward, pieces of the Blazers franchise were sold off at a court-ordered auction. The champions did not fare much better. Only days after the World Bowl, the Americans' office furniture was repossessed by sheriff's deputies. The financial losses were mind-blowing. The Hawaiians had lost $3.2 million, while the New York Stars' Charlotte Hornets had over $2 million of debt, and just $94,000 in assets. The Jacksonville Sharks and Detroit Wheels were liquidated owing nearly $4 million, and Detroit had 122 creditors looking to recoup losses. Many NFL stars who had been attracted to the league quickly sought to get out of their contracts. Quarterback Ken Stapler, defensive end L.C. Greenwood, and quarterback Craig Morton all were able to get courts to nullify their contracts with WFL teams, while former NFL veterans like George Sauer, Charlie Haraway, Leroy Kelly, and Don Maynard all limped off into retirement. Homegrown talent, like quarterbacks Tony Adams and Danny White, quickly bolted for the NFL, with Adams landing with the Kansas City Chiefs and White with the Dallas Cowboys, and Florida head coach Jack Purdy got Star Blazers tight end Greg Latter to jump ship with him to the NFL's Bears. 1975 season equals. Though many predicted the WFL was dead, the league returned for the 1975 season. During the off-season, Hemeta developed a plan to restore a measure of financial sanity to the league by paying players and coaches based on a percentage of revenues, while imposing strict capitalization requirements on the teams. Several markets from 1974 returned under new team names and new ownership. The deceased Sharks of Jacksonville came back as the Express. The Portland Storm became the Portland Thunder, the Birmingham Americans were replaced by the Vulcans, and the Chicago Fire became the Winds. The World Bowl runner-up Florida Blazers folded, and their franchise rights were relocated to San Antonio, Texas, as the San Antonio Wings. Akron, Ohio was briefly mentioned as a location for the 12th WFL team, but this never materialized, and only 11 teams would play in the 1975 season. Only 2 teams, Memphis and Philadelphia, returned with the same ownership from the prior season. Sports Illustrated, in its post-mortem, noted that the change between 1974 and 1975 was so drastic that it was as if the WFL's 2 seasons were played by totally different leagues. The WFL of 1974 was described as a bombastic credit risk, while the WFL of 1975 was a safer but much quieter entity that failed because it was ignored. An idea produced by the league was to have players wear different colors of pants based on their position. Offensive linemen were to wear purple pants, running backs green pants, receivers blue pants, linebackers red, and defensive backs yellow. Quarterbacks and kickers were to wear white pants. In addition to the colors, the pants were also adorned with items such as pinstripes or large stars for those not watching on color television. After a test run in preseason games, this idea was scrapped. The league changed the scheduling format from 20 games without exhibitions to 18 games with exhibitions. Gone were weeknight games. The new schedule had games on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. But the league still was snake-bitten, as although the original plan called for a July 5 preseason opener and August 2 regular season openers, the regular season had to open a week earlier, with a single game on Saturday, July 26, due to a stadium conflict. This meant that a single regular season game was played in the midst of the last weekend of preseason play. Several more NFL free agents, including Calvin Hill and Ted Kolek, signed on with the struggling WFL. Memphis had secured 3 top-line, but fading Dolphin stars in Larry Csonka, Jim Kiick, and Paul Warfield. The Southern California Sun secured the services of former AFL and NFL quarterback Darrell LaMonica. The Chicago Winds made an offer to aging Super Bowl III MVP Joe Namath, who seriously considered the offer, before refusing and re-signing with the New York Jets. The Winds invested considerable money and time in the effort to sign Namath and all but promised he was coming to Chicago. The embarrassing rejection by Namath crippled the Winds, who folded 5 weeks into the season. It also resulted in the loss of the WFL's national television deal, rendering the league all but invisible. Despite Hemeta's efforts, several teams soon ran into financial difficulties, in part due to alarmingly low attendance figures. The Winds were expelled 5 games into the season after dropping below league capitalization requirements, leaving the league with 10 teams. It was not enough to stem the tide. By late October, rumors abounded that 4 of the remaining teams were on the verge of folding. On October 22, just a few days before the start of Week 13, the WFL went out of business. Hemeta said that the league would have needed to spend as much as $40 million over 2 years to be successful, a bill that the league's directors, 7 of whom sat on the boards of banks, did not feel could be justified. The Birmingham Vulcans, with a league best record of 9-3, were proclaimed league champions. With the relative financial stability of the Birmingham and Memphis clubs, both attempted to join the NFL but were refused. In 1979, the Memphis club owners filed an antitrust suit against the NFL. Their case was ultimately dismissed on May 30, 1984, by which time the owners had already established the Tampa Bay Bandits in the next professional league, the United States Football League. Although the NFL expanded by 2 teams in 1976, that expansion had been planned before the WFL's first season, and neither city had hosted a WFL franchise. One of the issues facing the WFL going into 1975 was how to hold a draft. The owners of the WFL teams collectively agreed they did not have the money to seek out the top college prospects. Instead, the league came up with a different plan. Instead of drafting a certain player, a WFL team would draft an entire NFL or CFL team. This gave that team the rights to negotiate with players under contract for that team. For example, only the Charlotte Hornets had the right to offer contracts to players from the Buffalo Bills, Baltimore Colts, and Detroit Lions, and only the Chicago Winds could offer contracts to players from the Pittsburgh Steelers, New York Jets, and Edmonton Eskimos of the Canadian Football League. Legacy the league's struggles led to endless sarcastic comments. Chicago Fire offensive lineman Steve Wright quipped that he had been offered $1 million contract, $1 a year for 1 million years. In the 1976 season, Memphis Southman coach John McVay joined the staff of the New York Giants and brought with him 9 players from the Southman. In what has been described as the closest approximation to a meeting between the champions of the WFL and the NFL, the Southman reinforced Giants upset the defending Super Bowl champion Pittsburgh Steelers 17-0 in a preseason match that year. The WFL, for all its embarrassing miscues, produced a number of coaches who found success in the NFL, notably Jack Pardee, Lindy Infante, and Marty Schottenheimer. Jim Fassel, a quarterbacks for the Hawaiians, became a head coach in the NFL and UFL, taking the New York Giants to Super Bowl XXXV in 2001 and the Las Vegas Locomotives to a win in the 2009 UFL Championship game. McVay worked his way up the Giants organization and eventually became the team's head coach. He had even more success as general manager of the San Francisco 49ers during the 1980s dynasty years. Several players, most notably Pat Hayden, Danny White, Alfred Jenkins, Greg Latta, and Vince Papale, later found success in the NFL as well. 3 WFL alumni made it to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Larry Csonka, Paul Warfield, and Curly Culp. All 3 were already established stars in the NFL before joining the WFL. The league's most severe impact was on the Miami Dolphins, who had just won consecutive Super Bowls before the WFL's snagging of 3 of their star players. This changed the course of NFL history, by opening the door to dominance by 2 other AFC teams, the Steelers and the Raiders, during the second half of the 1970s. While by no means the pioneer of singular team nicknames, which had been used by some college and professional sports teams since the 19th century, the quantity of them in a single league was rare in professional sports at the time, and was a distinguishing mark of the league. The WFL also arguably had an impact on locations of other professional football teams. From the NFL, Hawaii hosted the Pro Bowl from 1980 through 2009, and since 2011, Jacksonville got the Jacksonville Jaguars in 1995, Charlotte received the Carolina Panthers in the same year, and Houston's expansion franchise, the Texans, revived the name of the WFL team in 2002. Though the WFL's Toronto establishment failed due to Canadian resistance, the Buffalo Bills are playing occasional home games in Toronto as of 2008, and the league's original intent to expand the game globally is being partially fulfilled by the NFL International Series. Other cities became regular stops for franchises in other leagues. Memphis hosted the Showboats of the USFL from 1983 to 1985, the Mad Dogs of the CFL in 1995, and the XFL's Maniacs in 2001. The NFL also used Memphis as a temporary home for the Tennessee Oilers in 1997 before their stadium in Nashville was completed. Birmingham hosted the Vulcans and Magic of the AFA, Stallions of the USFL, the Fire of the WLAF from 1991 to 1992, Barracudas of the CFL in 1995, and the Thunderbolts of the XFL in 2001. Orlando hosted the Americans of the AFA, Renegades of the USFL, Thunder of the WLAF, Rage of the XFL and the Tuskers of the UFL. Shreveport later hosted the Steamers of the AFA and the Pirates of the CFL. Jacksonville hosted the Firebirds of the AFA and the Bulls of the USFL before the Jaguars franchise was awarded. In 2010, Jacksonville received an Arena Football League expansion franchise, which revived the Sharks name. Charlotte later hosted the Chargers of the AFA before the Panthers NFL franchise was awarded. Baltimore had an NFL team at the time of the WFL, but after their departure the Stars of the USFL and the Stallions of the CFL played in the city. The Stallions were forced to move to Montreal and become the current Montreal Alouettes when the NFL returned to Baltimore with the current Baltimore team, the Baltimore Ravens. San Antonio later hosted the Charros of the AFA, Gunslingers of the USFL, the Riders of the WLAF, the Texans of the CFL, the Matadors of the SFL, and 4 home games for the New Orleans Saints during their 2005 road season, in which the Saints had to abandon their usual stadium, the Louisiana Superdome, due to damage from Hurricane Katrina. Southern California hosted the Express of the USFL, the Extreme of the XFL, the Dragons of the SFL and was expected to host an as-yet unnamed franchise in the UFL, a promise that has yet to be fulfilled in the league's upcoming 4th season. The New York-New Jersey metropolitan area hosted the New Jersey Generals of the USFL, the New York Sentinels of the UFL, and 2 teams that bore both states' names. The Knights of the WLAF and the Hitmen of the XFL. Chicago hosted the Fire of the AFA, Blitz of the USFL and the Enforcers of the XFL. Detroit later hosted the Michigan Panthers of the USFL, and was targeted as a possibility for XFL expansion before the XFL folded. Portland later hosted the Breakers of the USFL and served as the launching point for the CFL USA initiative with an exhibition game in June 1992, though it never received a CFL team. The NFL's Houston Texans revived the name of the WFL's franchise for that city. Texans has also been used by an NFL Dallas team in 1952 the remnants of which became the Baltimore Indianapolis Colts, by an AFL Dallas team in the early 1960s who became the Kansas City Chiefs, by an Arena Football team in Dallas in the early 1990s, and by a CFL San Antonio team for 1 year in the 1990s. There is also a Major League Soccer team called the Chicago Fire, and there were also NBA teams called the Memphis Grizzlies and Charlotte Hornets. The Jacksonville Sharks and Portland Thunder names were later revived for teams in the 2010 revival of the Arena Football League. The American Football Association was conceived as a successor to the WFL, and in some newspapers was even referred to as the new WFL. Many of the AFA teams revived, with slight alterations, the names of WFL teams that had resided in respective cities, and several of the AFA's key personnel has previously served in similar capacities with WFL teams. The league also had some significantly negative long-term impacts for the lower levels of professional football. Its arrival resulted in the end of the ACFL and SFL, effectively killing minor league professional football in the United States until AFA's formation in 1979. NFL jumpers, several NFL players signed contracts, or in some cases, future contracts with teams in the World Football League. In the case of a future contract, this was when a player entering the final years of a contract with an NFL team would sign a contract with a WFL team that goes into effect the moment the player's obligation with his NFL club is finished. Each signing is broken down by team, said player's previous NFL club, and year player signed a contract. Just because a player signed doesn't mean he ever played for that team. L.C. Greenwood, for instance, never played a down of football for Birmingham. No one shown with a date after 1975 ever actually played for the WFL team listed due to the league's insolvency as of that year. Birmingham, Ross Bradbatcher, LB 1974, L.C. Greenwood Delaware, 1975, Charlie Haraway, RB 1974, Ron Jesse, W 1975, George Myra, QB 1974, Jim Mitchell, TE 1975, Mike Montgomery, RB 1975, Joe Profit, RB 1974, Jethro Pugh, DT 1976, Paul Robinson, RB 1975, Ken Stapler, QB 1976, Larry Willingham, DB 1974, Rayfield Wright, T 1977, Chicago, Virgil Carter, QB 1974, Bob McKay, T 1975, Detroit, Warren McVie, RB 1974. Mike Taylor, LB 1974, Florida, Bill Berge, LB 1976, Bob Davis, QB 1974, Fred Hoaglin, C 1975, Cecil Turner, W 1975, Perry Williams, RB 1975, Hawaiians, Vince Clements, RB 1975, John Douglas, LB 1975, Ron East, DT 1974, Ed Flanagan, C 1975, John Gilliam, W 1975, Ed Hargett, QB 1975, Calvin Hill, RB, John Issenbarger, W 1975, Randy Johnson, QB 1975, Ted Kwolek, TE 1975, Jim Sniadecki, LB 1975, John Wilbur, G 1975, Greg Wojcik, DT 1974, Houston, Bob Creech, LB 1974, Richmond Flowers, DB 1975, Craig Morton, QB 1975, Jacksonville, Guy Dennis, OG 1975, Chip Glass, TE 1975, Fair Hooker, W 1975, Ray Nettles, LB 1975, Bob Parrish, Delaware, 1975, Larry Smith, RB 1975, Harmon Wages, RB 1975, Memphis, Larry Csonka, RB 1975, John Harvey, RB 1975, Jim Kick, RB 1975, D.D. Lewis, LB 1975, Paul Warfield, W 1975, Ralph Hill, C 1975, New York, Al Barnes, W 1975, Carter Campbell Delaware, 1975, Brian Dowling, QB 1976, John Elliott, DT 1974, John Fuqua, RB 1976, Jerry Philbin, DT 1974, Philadelphia, Steve Tromizark, DT 1975, Ron Holiday, W 1975, Portland, Hayes Austin, DB 1975, Ron Billingsley, DT 1975, Levert Carr, T 1975, Tom Drugers, T 1976, Rocky Rasley, G 1976, Mike Taylor, T 1974, Steve Thompson, DT 1975, Clancy Williams, DB 1974, Southern California, Curly Culp, DT 1975, Doral LaMonica, QB 1975, Bob Newton, T 1976, Dave Williams, W 1974, Dick Witcher, TE 1975, many other players jumped as well. Dallas running back Dwayne Thomas signed with the Hawaiians in 1975 after being released by the Washington Redskins. Longtime Cleveland Browns running back Leroy Kelly signed with Chicago. Other players joined the WFL despite being drafted by NFL squads, such as quarterback Danny White, who signed with Memphis before eventually joining the NFL's Dallas Cowboys. Television and radio. The league's only national television contract was with the TBS television network, a syndicator of American sports programming. Merle Harmon and Alex Hawkins announced TBS Thursday Night Game. Guest announcers were often brought into the booth including Paul Hornung, George Plimpton, Alex Karras, and McLean Stevenson. According to TBS president Eddie Einhorn, the games actually got decent ratings at first. However, affiliates started bailing out after the Philadelphia and Jacksonville free ticket scandals, a trickle that became a flood after two teams moved in the middle of the season and two more folded altogether. By the time of the World Bowl, the games were struggling to achieve Nielsen ratings above 2.0, and TBS found it nearly impossible to sell advertising. Despite the losses, Einhorn was actually willing to stick it out until Hemeta announced the Winds were going to try to sign Namath. Einhorn told Hemeta that the league had effectively bet its whole credibility on Namath coming to Chicago, and none of TVS affiliates would commit to broadcasting the 1975 season unless Namath signed with the Winds. When he didn't, the WFL was left without a national television contract. The loss of such a critical revenue stream was a factor in the league's collapse midway through the season. Local affiliates provided most of the television and radio coverage throughout the WFL existence. Notable local announcers include John Sterling, Spencer Ross, Bob Shepard, Mike Patrick, Larry King, Larry Matson, Frederick Sington and Eddie Dowsett and Vince Lloyd. Had the WFL come into existence a few years later, the league might have succeeded, but the league predated the vast expansion of cable television and sports networks spearheaded by the birth of ESPN in 1979. The money infused by a national television contract with a major network and the national interest that game telecasts might have made all the difference for the fledgling league. Teams: Birmingham Americans 1974, Birmingham Vulcans 1975, Chicago Fire 1974, Chicago Winds 1975, Detroit Wheels 1974, Washington-Baltimore Ambassadors/Virginia Ambassadors Florida Blazers 1974/San Antonio Wings 1975, Honolulu, the Hawaiians 1974 Euro 75, Houston Texans 1974/Shreveport Steamer 1974 Euro 75, Jacksonville Sharks 1974/Jacksonville Express 1975, Memphis Southmen 1974 Euro 1975/Memphis Grizzlies 1975. Boston Bulls New York Stars 1974/Charlotte Stars 1974/Charlotte Hornets 1974 Euro 75, Philadelphia Bell 1974 Euro 75, Portland Storm 1974/Portland Thunder 1975, Southern California Sun 1974 Euro 75. Stadiums: Legion Field, Birmingham, Soldier Field, Chicago, Rynearson Stadium, Detroit, Citrus Bowl, Orlando, Alamo Stadium, San Antonio, Honolulu Stadium, Aloha Stadium, Honolulu, Astrodome, Houston, State Fair Stadium, Shreveport, Gator Bowl Stadium, Jacksonville, Liberty Bowl Stadium, Memphis, Downing Stadium, New York, American Legion Memorial Stadium, Charlotte, John F. Kennedy Stadium, Philadelphia, Franklin Field, Philadelphia, Civic Stadium, Portland, Anaheim Stadium. Rules: the WFL had several important rules differences from the National Football League of that era, and many were eventually adopted by the older league. Touchdowns were worth 7 points, instead of 6. Conversions were called action points, and could only be scored via a run or pass play, and were worth 1 point. The ball was placed on the 2.5-yard line for an action point. This rule was a revival of a 1968 preseason experiment by the NFL and American Football League. The XFL employed a similar rule for its only season in 2001. Kickoffs were from the 30-yard line instead of the 40. Before 1974, NFL teams kicked off from the 40. Starting in 1974, the NFL moved its kickoffs back to the 35, and 20 years later, the kickoff line was pushed back to the 30. Receivers needed only 1 foot in bounds for a legal pass reception, instead of 2 feet in the NFL then and now. College and high school football, the Arena Football League, and the CFL have always used the 1-foot rule. Bump and run pass coverage was outlawed once a receiver was 3 yards beyond the line of scrimmage. The NFL adopted this rule in 1978, with a 5-yard bump zone. The goalposts were placed at the end line. At that time, college football goalposts were at the end line, but the NFL had its goalposts at the goal line from 1933 through 1973. Starting with the 1974 season, the NFL also moved its posts back to the end line to curb the then-growing dominance of place kickers. Missed field goals were returned to the line of scrimmage or the 20-yard line, whichever was farther from the goal line. The NFL also adopted this rule for its 1974 season. then replaced the line of scrimmage with the point of the kick in 1994. Before this rule, missed field goals were touchbacks, with the ball placed at the 20-yard line. U.S. college football later adopted this rule, but left the point as the line of scrimmage rather than the point of the placement. A player in motion was allowed to move toward the line of scrimmage before the snap, as long as he was behind the line of scrimmage at the snap. This rule had never been used at any level of outdoor American football, but was part of Canadian football. This rule is used in the Arena Football League and was used in the XFL. Punt returners were prohibited from using the fair catch, although the covering team could not come within 5 yards of the kick returner until he caught the ball. This rule also came from Canadian football, which still uses it, as does Arena Football with kickoffs and missed field goals. The XFL also used the so-called halo rule. Penalties for offensive holding and ineligible receiver downfield were 10 yards, instead of 15. Several years later, these became 10-yard penalties at all levels of football. The NFL made this rule change in 1977. Still later, the ineligible receiver penalty was changed to 5 yards. The WFL's original overtime system was like nothing used in any form of American football before or since. It was more similar to the system long used in international soccer. Overtime in the regular season was one fixed 15-minute period, divided into 2 halves of 7.5 minutes, each starting with a kickoff by one of the teams. The complete overtime was always played. There was no sudden death feature. In 1975, the WFL changed its overtime to the 15-minute sudden death period, which the NFL adopted in 1974 and still uses today. Limited preseason games. In 1974 and 1975, NFL teams played 6 preseason games and 14 regular season games. In contrast, the WFL's 1974 schedule called for 20 regular season games and no preseason games. In 1975, it was 18 regular season games and 2 preseason games. Summertime football. The NFL's regular season started on September 15 in 1974 and on September 21 in 1975. The WFL's regular season started on July 10 in 1974 and on July 26 in 1975. The Canadian Football League, which must contend with colder winters than American leagues, has always played during the summer with a similar schedule. Weeknight football. While NFL games were played mostly on Sundays and, from 1970 onwards, a game on Monday night, the WFL's 1974 schedule called for Wednesday night football. This scheduling format was abandoned in 1975. The featured Thursday night game was later adopted as Thursday night football by the NFL in 2006. The Ditka Rod. Instead of using a 10-yard chain strung between 2 sticks for measuring first down yardage, the WFL used a device called the Ditka Rod, ostensibly named for its inventor. This was a single stick, 90 inches long, mounted on a base which allowed it to pivot from side to side. The stick was swung down to ground level when a first down was being set, and a marker that slid along the shaft was fixed in place to line up with the nearest gridiron line. When that was set, the stick was swung back to the upright position. When a measurement was needed by the officials, the Ditka Rod was brought out to the ball position, the shaft swung down to ground level, the marker lined up with the nearest gridiron line, and the measurement was taken. Commissioners: Gary L. Davidson 1973-74, Christopher Hemeter 1974-75. See also, 1974 World Football League season, 1975 World Football League season, World Bowl, List of leagues of American football, WFL all-time team. References. External links: WFL team statistics, Tribute site, second Tribute site, WFL at DMOZ, World Football League helmets, World Football League program art, Philadelphia Bell WFL football page.